welcome to everyone here in presence and at home. Good evening to everyone. It's with great pleasure that I have the privilege to initiate these two series of seminar of the Venice Center for Digital and Public Humanities, the first seminar of the first series, while by introducing Vincent Dziekan. Well, I'm going to read. He has a really huge CV, and then just highlight some more important information in order to present you. Vince is a senior academic and researcher at the Monash Art, Design and Architecture University in Monash in Australia, and a research fellow with the Institute for Digital Culture at the University of Leicester. His work engages with the transformation of contemporary curatorial practices at the intersection of emerging design practices, creative technology, and museum culture. The scope of this interdisciplinary investigation is reflected in his books Virtual and the Art of Exhibition, Curatorial Design for Multimedia Museum, the Routledge Handbook of Museum, Media and Communication, co-edited with Christian Dortner, Ross Perry and Kim Christian Schroeder, and the Museum and Digital Confidence and the Museum and Design Practices forthcoming. I can't wait to read it. Vince has published widely in traditional scholarly as well as non-traditional modes through his independent curatorial practice, including as founding curator of MWX, the exhibition initiatives from Museum and the Web in the United States, and through his research engagement in the field, including as a chief investigator for Future Museum in Austria, and with the Institute for Digital Culture, where he is involved in establishing a set of international research observatories and academies focusing on cultural sector challenges and needs. His today's conference, entitled Digital Museum Transformation in the Phase of Datafication, offers the chance to take stock of formative steps being taken towards a European research program focusing on data literacies for cultural sector by documenting problem-setting activities that have been undertaken to investigate this problem space by prompting this question. How is the digital museum transforming in the phase of datafication? Wow. Vince, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, I'll slide over. Hello, everybody, and hello, big green couch here in the front, and everybody who's here in the room at the back, and also everybody online. It's very nice to have the opportunity to speak, directly with you here today. Very fortunate to find myself in Venice for this week. So it's wonderful to have been able to sort of schedule something to coincide. So that's really great. So I'm going to hopefully be able to navigate our system here and take us through, I guess, a bit of a talk. And I have to say, it was kind of very enjoyable for me to sort of bring some of the material together here, because it kind of helped me to think through a few things that I'm currently still processing and trying to work through around this topic of sort of museums and datafication. And so the seminar for me has been a nice chance to kind of try and sort of put some ideas together and some, I guess, some formative ideas around that as well. So I thank you for the opportunity to do that. Let's see how we go. I'm going to start, and hopefully we're going to be able to play a video just to set the scene. So the work that I just showed you there is a work that was commissioned for a new museum that just opened in Melbourne called the National Communication Museum. And it's located or sort of taken over a disused telecommunications center and is set up as a museum to I guess kind of engage with the ideas of how telecommunications have kind of evolved over time and how artists as well as people are generally kind of now working with digital content in new and interesting ways. And this is a work by a Melbourne-based artist named Rel Fan, which I think was really quite evocative and again sort of set the tone for that new museum. So as much as anything, I'm introducing that as just a bit of a evocative introduction to what I'd like to get through in the talk. So yep, we're going to be sort of looking at this idea of sort of the digital museum and its transformation in the face of datafication. And in terms of sort of just by way of introduction to give you an idea of who I am and where some of the things that I'll be talking about come from, not to rehash kind of the introduction, but again, my research has kind of really been sort of focusing for the past 25 years on this idea of the digital museum and how we have seen sort of museums transform because of new media. And I guess I entered into that sort of field as an artist, as a curator, and in that way sort of working with new media as an art form. But increasingly that sort of scope sort of extended much more widely to the way that we see museums, broadly speaking, having transformed in the face of technology. So that's where sort of the work that I'm currently doing, which is far more in the sort of, I guess, writing space, has kind of come from. In terms of, my background, I'm based at Monash University, which is in Melbourne. One of the reasons why I'm here in Australia is because Monash also has a permanent centre in Prato, which is just outside of Florence. And I'm engaged in sort of taking students from Australia here. We've just been sort of at the Venice Biennale for the last couple of days as part of an intensive study abroad program. I'm also engaged with our center in Prato because of our new sort of research foundation. And again, that's one of the points of contact that we've fortunately been able to establish with you guys here at Cafoskary. I'm affiliated most closely with SensiLab, which is one of our many different research labs within the university. SensiLab is our kind of interdisciplinary creative technology lab. And I supervise PhD students in that space who are kind of doing practice-based research around a range of different, I guess, kind of utilizing different technologies, some of which I'll show you later in the presentation. I'm also affiliated with the Monash Data Futures Institute, which is one of our university-wide strategic sort of initiatives. I'm also linked with the Institute for Digital Culture as a research fellow. The Institute for Digital Culture is at the University of Leicester in the UK. And I'm involved in sort of establishing a number of our international sort of what we're referring to as research observatories, one of which we established here in Italy through our work at the Prato Center. And of course, Cafoskary was one of our sort of partners in that sort of new observatory organization. In terms of things that are upcoming and that I'll sort of speak to in, I guess, kind of passing as part of the presentation, we have a new book coming out next year. Actually, it's a 3-volume encyclopedia of new media art. I'm one of the 3 general editors of that publication. And I've also kind of sort of focused specifically on 1 volume looking at curation and culture. And the other part of what I do is as a series editor for a series with Routledge, which is called Critical Perspectives on Museums and Digital Technology. And again, I'll refer to a couple things in the presentation around that. again, just so that everybody kind of has a sense of kind of, where we're at. Monash Art Design and Architecture is the faculty that I'm part of. We run undergraduate and postgraduate courses across a range of different sort of design fields. And the main thing that we do in terms of our higher degree research is advocate for practice-based research as our primary paradigm. That's something that we brought into the research context of the university. And it's meant that over the past 20 years, we've kind of really established that grounding for how artists, designers can bring their practice directly into the research kind of context. And so that's been one of the main things I've been involved in. As I mentioned, SensiLab is our kind of anti-disciplinary research lab, looking at the intersection of art and design and computer science. And I guess that has focused most directly on electronic media arts. We also have been running a summer academy in Prato, of which I'll talk about later as maybe one of the things that we can start thinking about together in the future. The Monash Data Futures Institute, as I said, is a strategic research initiative of the university. And one of those kind of focuses, of course, is on the ideas of around AI for social good. And we have engaged in that through looking at the digital culture aspect of that. In terms of Prato, just for, again, the information for everybody in terms of the relationship here in Italy, Monash has a permanent center in Prato where we've been for the past 20 years. We'll be celebrating 25 years in a couple of years' time. And that really has been kind of a foothold for one of Australia's largest universities to have an international base here in Italy, in Europe. We've mainly utilized that center for study abroad programs, but with the introduction of the Monash University European Research Foundation, we're now actively in a position to actually be involved in European research partnerships. And again, that's part of the work that I'm doing, is trying to mobilize ourselves in that space. And one of the ways that we're doing that is by looking for collaborative research opportunities and initiating those, and trying to build kind of these kind of connective networks, looking at, I guess, kind of digital culture research in particular. And we had the great opportunity in July this year, to have Elisa present on behalf of CAF Foscari as part of our research observatory, initial research observatory meeting. And that sort of brought together, as you see, a whole host of other Italian universities and also cultural organizations. And that presents us with a really unique way of doing kind of research in this space. The things that are, I guess, inspiring this particular talk come out of a related activity that we did a couple months ago in Austria. One of our other sort of European footholds is with the Belvedere, which is the major museum in Vienna, and working with their research, their research center. We ran a week-long program on data literacy for the cultural sector in September, and that brought together 15 museum workers from a range of different German and Austrian museums, all working in various ways with digital collections to kind of explore this idea of data literacy. And again, we ran that as a project with the Institute for Digital Culture. We kind of explored this idea of data in a particular kind of sort of manner, and it kind of, these are the sort of aspects that we explored in that process, which I think is relevant to what we're talking about here today. Recognizing that data, in terms of cultural data, we have to kind of understand it, or we're proposing that we need to understand it through these various aspects. So how do we engage with the social elements, okay, that align to data? What are those sort of sensory aspects? And how does the creative potential of data kind of come in as well? And we explored that by myself kind of looking at kind of the creative potential, which I'll talk through a little bit more in this talk. But my colleagues, Ross Parry from the Institute for Digital Culture, explored the idea of the sensory aspects. this kind of relates to the ideas around how we need to kind of, I guess, kind of move away from certain kind of ableist tendencies within museums that have privileged, in particular, sort of vision and ocular-centric ways of thinking, to recognize that there are many other sort of sensory aspects that we need to kind of understand, and that we equally need to bring that to the way that we work with data. In terms of social elements, our colleague Aaron Rees from the University of Leeds kind of presented on that idea, exploring how we actually work with digital objects, how we think about kind of what those kind of particular sort of significant properties of digital objects are, and how we need to kind of find new sort of new ways of actually, I guess, kind of cataloging and working with collections data. This is part of a larger sort of UK-based project, which is called the Museums Data Service, of which kind of the Institute for Digital Culture is the lead organization. So I'll kind of move into kind of talking about creative data most specifically, but I'm just kind of contextualizing kind of where some of this discussion comes from. So when we think about this, we'll start with the idea of the museum itself. And I'm using this kind of illustration here of Ole Wurm's sort of, what's known as the Museum Wormarium, which was basically his kind of efforts to classify and catalog these artifacts as a museum. As the quote kind of says, museums have always been mixed reality spaces, and in recent times, they've become permeated with digital technology, mediated forms of communication, and data that have transformed them into unique cultural spaces that bring an increasing variety of media together in distinctive ways. And if we go back to this origin story of the museum, we see museums kind of trying to kind of sort of parse together these different sort of material forms, but also their informational kind of aspects. The Museum Wormarium kind of was actually a catalog, right? It was an effort to kind of produce this cataloging activity, and its main translation was actually into a publication, even though when we see this kind of example of a display in a room, we think of it as being spatial. The idea of the Wormarium was actually of this type of classificatory system that was turned into a large form of catalog. When we compare that sort of origin story to where we see kind of museums today and the types of spaces, informational spaces that we now see in museums, there's some interesting kind of overlaps taking place. I've written about this idea of cultural architecture, which is going to be sort of included in the Encyclopedia of New Media Art. And, cultural architectures of museums have effectively sort of evolved in various ways. And again, that evolution has most recently involved digital. And when we sort of see that manifest itself, we see these types of spaces now becoming far more commonplace in many different museum settings. This is from the Australian Centre for the Moving Image in Melbourne. This is ACME. And this is a space in the museum that they refer to as the Constellation. What the Constellation space does is it actually takes the data of visitors who have just been interacting with the museum space and actually manifests that as an installation. So what the ACME viewing experience is based on is every visitor who visits the museum is actually given a cardboard disc, which I don't know if any of you remember an old sort of toy that was called a Viewmaster. Viewmasters were these little kind of sort of viewing devices that you would put a little show reel in, and you would click through it like binoculars, and you would see these kind of sort of images, kind of like slides, right? The Viewmaster reel was kind of what the inspiration for this particular device called the lens, all right, at ACME. And it basically embeds a NFC technology into this cardboard disc. And as you interact with the museum, you're basically tapping on different kind of devices to record your interest in certain objects and artifacts in the display space. When you sort of have that data then sort of translated for you in the constellation, what it does is it sort of actually draws together a whole range of different affinities based on kind of the things that you selected to record with your lens device. And so it's in a way kind of taking the latent catalog that's there, all right, and starting from your viewing experience in the museum and translating that into a visual experience for other visitors. But it also means that your experience from the museum is something that you take away with you, and that you also have the opportunity of then connecting to other media post-experience. So it's an interesting way to see, again, the role that data plays in terms of creating cultural experience. One of the things that does, in my way of working this through, is it kind of problematizes this relationship between collection and display, which we kind of see in a binary sort of way. We see them as, in a way, sort of moving in two kind of different directions. The collecting activity is something that kind of happens, inside the museum and behind the scenes. It involves that sort of data collection and the data processing. Display, on the other hand, is kind of, outward facing. It's more about the visitor experience. It kind of sort of moves in a different direction. It kind of draws that kind of content and presents it. And again, it often only presents one face of that as well. It kind of, again, presents primarily that sort of visual face and not everything else that's kind of there in the collection. So one of the things I think that's starting to become more interesting in the constellation at Acme is, I think, a bit of a way for us to think this through, is we see collection and display kind of sort of working together in a much more kind of integrated way. One doesn't precede necessarily the other. They kind of sort of feed off of each other in an interesting kind of fashion. And so I think that's one of the interesting things when we start thinking about, again, the way that data is changing some of these precepts around how we think museums should work. So when we talk about display, this is just some dictionary definition, around that. One of the things I think that's interesting in display is this idea of making manifest, right? Of actually the act of showing, the act of performing, right, becomes part of what display does. When we think about collection, we have kind of some very standard definitions around that, about gathering stuff together and assembling it in certain ways. But another, of course, interpretation of this idea of to collect is also to manifest, to summon up, to bring into action, to perform. So it's that performative aspect that I think is kind of really interesting when we start to think about the way that data is actually performed in museum spaces. And that also means that the whole nature of how we interact with all other aspects that we associate with museums also becomes more performative. This is something that, in putting this sort of talk together, as you can see with my little scribbles on this diagram, it was a way for me to kind of sort of start to think about some ideas that I've been trying to work through. This sort of movement, basically, of how we sort of see the pre-digital move into the digital and into the post-digital, is something that I've kind of theorized and something that I've written about in my previous work. When we see the digital as being a particular era of how museums sort of operate, we see this relationship of spatial practice and digital mediation starting to kind of blend, right? So while they're on different tracks, they actually create a space where there's more kind of movement in between them. As we move out of the digital into the post-digital and beyond, we start to see, again, different kind of ways that the museum starts to work. And so this idea of kind of where we are now is where we're now moving out of a digital era into a more dataful era. And we start to need to kind of then reconceptualize some of the things that we talk about. So in a pre-digital way, we thought about exhibition, okay, and the spatial practice of exhibition as being a distinct tract. The whole kind of virtual aspect of that was a separate track, but they start to kind of blend and overlap with each other, a bit like a DNA kind of spiral when we see them braided in this way. And when we get into this new idea of the dataful aspects of museums, we start to have to, I think, kind of reconceptualize ideas around space. And we need to think about cultural architectures that are equally digital and physical. And similarly, we have to think of the way that we sort of work with programming, and we start to, again, sort of blend that idea of collecting and display and see them as merging in a new way and become more performative. So these are the ideas, you know, that I've kind of consistently sort of worked with and continue to kind of sort of see us move forward. In terms of where, I guess, kind of some things sort of connect with this, and again, just to share this with everybody, these are 3 different sort of projects that I've had certain involvement with over the past couple of years. And I'll just kind of briefly touch on those as part of bringing this presentation to a bit of a close. One of those is a research project, which is in Canada, which is looking at, again, the idea of collections in art museums. It's called CIECO. It's run out of a number of different museums and universities in Quebec. They're looking at this idea of, again, the way that digital is changing the way that we think about collections. And I have had an opportunity to also kind of present as one of their sort of invited sort of, I guess, kind of, you know, scholars and researchers to sort of prompt this project forward. That project obviously continues through 2028. So it's one that you might want to kind of check out if this is of interest to you. And their basic ideas are around investigating how collections now need to be kind of understood in different parameters. That's their working concept. This idea that we need to think about collections in relationship to time, space, but also performance, right? The way that collections are actually used, how they become more event-driven, and how, in fact, what is being collected in museums today, artworks of certain types, also mean that as media artworks, they have an innate sort of performativity or a performance aspect to them that we have to think about when we start to deal with you know, them as collections. There's also a project that was done recently called the Museums and AI Network, which is a project that was run out of the UK by a couple scholars, Una Murphy and Elena Villaspesa. Both Una and Elena are working on a book with us with the Critical Perspectives on Museums and Digital Technology series, where we'll be bringing kind of this work into a broader context around museums and datafication. So I thought I would share briefly some of the work that they have already done in that space, but we'll be taking this forward with them in an upcoming publication. As they kind of said in that little sort of quote, when considering using AI technologies, museums need to think about the potential benefits and challenges that such technologies present. As such, it's important to not only understand the technology you intend to use, but also what data it will require as input and what data it will generate as output. So again, recognizing that the way that we need to think about collection and display is that they have to kind of be thought about as working in a much more kind of integrated way together, not as one or the other, but effectively being able to be both. They did as part of that Museums and AI Network sort of research project. Again, you can find existing content online if it's of interest to you. They actually did a series of case studies with a number of different museums, the American Museum of Natural History, the National Gallery in London, and also the Met, and looked at ways that those museums were finding different usages and ways of incorporating a range of different AI-based technologies into their programming. So again, that's something that you might be interested in looking at. And lastly, the final sort of example I showed you was based on a project and a chapter that I wrote for a book looking at museums and presence, technologies of presence, which was published by Routledge last year. And this was a chapter that we wrote on designing cultural experiences within what we refer to as technosocial systems. So when we're looking at that, we're talking about there being, again, this kind of sort of codependent relationship that's happening between technology and the way that we sort of socially interact and the way that art becomes part of that experience as well. So that chapter kind of did focus on, or we used as kind of reference points, a series of different PhD projects that we've been working with through SensiLab, and that I'll share with you here to close things off. So this is a project by Lucia Ivsic. This was a project where she was looking at kind of photogrammetry or utilizing photogrammetry as a way of kind of looking at ideas of home and sort of domesticity. One of the important sort of reference points for this project was that it actually took place during COVID. And Lucia was actually is actually Croatian, but studying with us in Melbourne. And she had just started her PhD project as soon as kind of COVID hit, and found herself basically locked up in her apartment for the early part of her sort of PhD program, having sort of traveled all the way from Croatia to Melbourne. That was kind of her initial experience. And so that's sort of translated then into this type of project where, again, using kind of point clouds, right? She's kind of animated this space and infiltrated that space with interactivity and also different acoustic cues, so that basically the space has a visual register of being a place in Melbourne, but the sounds that overlay onto that are actually from a family meal in Croatia that she kind of was able to kind of record as during that sort of lockdown period. So again, using kind of the technology of photogrammetry and using kind of point clouds as actually the data to kind of drive the actual kind of content, the visual content, but also the interactive way of working with that sort of VR experience. This is another project by another of our PhDs, Oscar Raby, who is generally a VR producer, but he's working more widely with a range of different extended reality technologies. This is a project that he did with a heritage site in Melbourne, which is called Ripon Lee. It's a kind of a colonial mansion in Melbourne. So it kind of has a very sort of Victorian era sort of overlay to it. And one of the things that this project was about was how the actual garden space, which had a lake, sort of built into it, a man-made lake built into it, was actually on, because we're in Australia, was actually on sort of indigenous land that actually subterranean watercourses, right, are below ground. So it's an interesting kind of project in that the way that he's used AR technology here is actually as a means of kind of scanning. So while you're kind of using your phone and there's a visual kind of cue to it, it's actually about kind of creating a soundscape as you actually move the phone up and down. So you're basically getting the sound of subterranean water, okay, as you sort of move the phone in that type of way. And the last sort of project that again sort of was exploring sort of these ideas, and this is a piece that particularly used AI as a generative AI, was this piece by Nina Radjic, which is called Mirror Ritual. And the idea of Mirror Ritual is that the viewer, okay, will kind of encounter a round mirror in a space, and the mirror itself has an embedded sort of webcam in it that actually picks up facial expression. It uses kind of that sort of sentiment or emotion analysis, and it generates then a poem, okay, on the surface of the mirror for each individual sort of viewer. It kind of emerges and then disappears. And so again, with this type of piece, we're seeing the actual kind of, activation and performance of data in this poetic sort of way. So those are the projects that I wanted to kind of share, okay, with you in the seminar. And again, to try and sort of use them to explore those ideas about that movement from this concept of the digital museum into this phase of moving towards the dataful museum, and how we need to kind of start sort of exploring that sort of transition in a creative way. And I'd just like to kind of finish things off by kind of sort of just putting forward a couple points for potential discussion. And this is as much for us sharing with all of you here, but it's equally for us to be sharing with our colleagues here at CAF OSCAR and here in the lab as well, because these might be some interesting touch points for us in terms of collaboration moving forward. One of those has to do with this project, our publication project called Critical Digital. So Critical Digital, as Ross Parry and myself refer to it as the series editors, is our publication series with Routledge, Critical Perspectives on Museums and Digital Technology. We are actively sort of looking for publication projects. The way that Ross and I work is we actually have treated the publication series as a bit of like, as if we were running a gallery in a way. We kind of are not interested per se in just receiving random proposals. We're actually interested in working with people to develop projects. So we're certainly open to hear from people around the work that they're doing. There may be opportunities then because of certain editorial projects that we're thinking of putting together to invite some people to contribute chapters. And we're also just looking at kind of building that sort of stable of kind of artists, writers, practitioners to actually, begin to kind of explore some interesting territories with us. So currently, we had our first book come out of the series earlier this year, which was looking at museums and the history of computing. We have 3 books that will be coming out early next year on museums and digital transformation, museums and design practices that I'm writing, and another book on museums and digital confidence that I'm co-editing. We have upcoming books looking at accessible design. We have books coming out on inclusive technology. We're having a book that we're putting together on datafication. So again, those are all the types of projects that we currently have on the books, but we're certainly open to hearing from people with either new ideas that they would like to explore with us, or just to make us aware, okay, of certain things that people are doing so that when those opportunities present themselves, we're kind of aware. So that's one sort of reference point. The other is the Prato Academy. So the Prato Academy is a program that we have run for the past 2 years, and we'll be running this again next July in Prato at the Monash Center. This is a PhD summer school, effectively, that we've kind of sort of put together. It's been run with SensiLab and the Institute for Digital Culture as a collaboration. The first year that we did it, our focus was on the idea of research action, and we brought together PhD students then from both Monash, Leicester, and an open call, okay, for people from around the world. So we had students coming from as far away as Hong Kong and, let's say, Amsterdam and Europe, all kind of joining us for that sort of intensive workshop. This past year, we ran the program sort of with the University of Leiden, University of Leicester, and Monash. And next year, we're going to be running that program again and also being joined by the Academy of Theatre and Digitality from Dortmund in Germany. This past year, we had Ars Electronica involved in the program with us. So we worked with colleagues from Future Lab, and we sort of ran that as a week-long sort of summer school. That's again an opportunity, I believe, for us potentially to have some closer collaborations for perhaps some of you guys here in the lab itself. And again, things that we can kind of talk about collaborating on in the future. And as you can see with the image, we had an awful lot of fun putting together our kind of promotional materials using DALL-E in particular, and getting kind of these kind of PhD students with 6 fingers and weird physiognomies and promoting it in that fashion. The final point of reference for us is the relationship that Ca' Foscari and Monash share with an existing kind of university alliance, which is known as Utopia. And that Utopia Alliance, which includes this range of universities that you see on the screen, presents us with, I think, an opportunity to kind of activate the research observatory that we're already, kind of connected through, and have some potential to kind of collaborate in the future. Personally, I will be representing Monash in Paris in a month's time, because the focus of the next Utopia meeting is on cultural heritage. And again, I'm not sure if perhaps some of our colleagues from Ca' Foscari will also be sort of attending. But regardless of that, we have our existing observatory relationship, and I think we can definitely kind of leverage this and do some more things in the future. One of those things that we're looking to develop is a doctoral network application. This is through the Marie Curie doctoral network scheme. And we'll be putting that together in partnership with the Institute for Digital Culture and also the Monash University European Research Foundation. We would love Ca' Foscari to obviously be sort of a partner potentially in that. And the current way that we're conceptualizing this is the idea that both universities, research institutes, and also cultural organizations can all play a part in this network, and in a variety of different ways, whether as a home institution where PhD students might be aligned to the actual project, but equally, we might find other configurations for different partners where we might have labs contribute into that group. We might see certain labs or organizations act as hubs that bring the group together at different points of time over the course of the project, and that we also see sites that act as hosts for the ability for our PhDs to kind of mobilize and move through that network. Again, those are things that we're sort of opening up at the moment, and we're at a very formative stage of that, but we would love to think that that's something that we can kind of explore together, with the lab here at Ca' Foscari. So that's the type of things that I'm putting on the agenda. Thank you for the chance, to speak with you today. Happy to take any questions. And similarly, I'm really looking forward to kind of the ongoing sort of conversations that we will have with our colleagues here, and see what we can kind of be doing together in this really interesting space. And let's work it out together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We definitely have to start our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
For all those input and also for showing us all this range of activities we are so eager to participate and jump into. So, first of all, let's open the question time. Especially addressing my students to ask, especially the students that are attending investigating museum collection.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
So don't be shy. As you have seen, there are really a wide and open set of interpretation and access to museum, not only to collection, but to performance, to data, to interaction, to art and art creation.
Yeah.
So we are a little bit beyond the almost old-fashioned concept that digital museum is a digital catalog, digital data of museum. Is something more. What's it? I don't know. What idea do you have about it? Take the chance, please, to ask the question.
I'd be interested to know what people think a digital museum is, right? We use the word, but what does it actually mean? That was one of the things that started me off when I did my PhD. Was, I was kind of interested in why are we using that term? Why are we referring to the virtual museum? The virtual museum was kind of the buzzword when I actually did my PhD. And, the virtual museum was this idea that you didn't need a physical museum anymore, right? That basically we have the internet, we can actually have kind of the museum kind of, sort of there online. In some ways, much of what museums have in terms of collections and information is actually better suited to exist probably in that format because it becomes more available, more accessible, that type of thing. But I was always kind of really reluctant to kind of sort of just embrace this idea and recognize that sort of virtual means more things than just online, right? It's kind of has a different sort of, we can have virtual experiences in real places and real spaces. Reading a book can be considered a virtual experience. Your imagination, can take you to those types of places. So this idea of the virtual museum kind of didn't really, for me, make sense. It was too simplistic in some ways and distorted, all of that nuance. So digital museum, I think, is something that, again, is an easy thing to say, but it means many different things. So yeah, I'd be interested to know if you guys have any sense of, what that means to you.
Open the chat. There's a question.
Okay, let's have a look.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you address the sustainability of curation in the context of obsolescence? Whoa, this is
okay, interesting. It is the mode that a lot of kind of work in museums today involves. There's a lot of contention around kind of curating. We have some issues in Australia at the moment around that as well. Some museums are kind of really sort of looking at, I guess, kind of the way that we need to be more co-creative in the way that curation happens. The idea that the curator is the expert, right, is becoming kind of a much more contentious idea, and that actually, curators are better as mediators, or they're better as kind of activators rather than as being the expert, right, in that sort of knowledge space. There are many other types of knowledges and other knowledge holders, right, that we need to kind of engage in this way. So the sustainability of curation is kind of, I think, a really important sort of question. And yeah, like I said, there are museums. One of those museums that's we've written about in the book on museums and design practices is the Museum of Us, which is a museum in San Diego, California. And they have actually, as part of their evolution, actually moved away from having curators to actually having designers work in the museum. So they've actually recognized that, again, that sort of role of the curator is actually not the way they need to work, because they're engaging with different communities. They're looking at sort of, again, the role that designers are actually more important than curators in their particular context. So it's an interesting kind of state of affairs around authority, basically, and curators are seen as that focal point of being the authority in the museum. And again, that becomes very highly contentious and charged today.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on that question, like, how do you decide what works would be built, like belong in a permanent collection versus what would be rotating at the time, since it's like, yeah, since giving the sensibility of digital art, like how it changes all the time, compared to not classic.
Yeah, again, you know, that's where there are, I think, a couple interesting examples where, you know, how the role of collecting, how the role of a collecting institution functions. You know, I'm thinking of how the V&A Museum in London, you know, kind of introduced a separate curating strand to what they do, which was called rapid response curating. It was an actual kind of sort of program that they introduced probably about 10 years ago now. The idea of rapid response curating was that the decision making around objects to collect, and this was particularly dealing with sort of like design objects, it's a design museum, and the idea that, you know, that might mean, you know, collecting a meme, right, or collecting you know, some aspect of social media, right? How does that sort of find its way into a museum? And how does that still retain a timeliness then? Because the way that so many kind of collecting processes traditionally in a museum are quite long and quite sort of, sort of drawn out. The idea of how does that sort of ability to kind of capture things in a more timely way and to actually bring them into the collection equally. That was what the rapid response curating sort of program tried to do. So I think there are kind of those different sort of ways, you know, to go. And I think that's an interesting example around. Yeah.
We have a question from the audience at home. Predrag Radanovic, if you want, you can turn on your microphone and ask the question or the comment by yourself.
Okay, I hope that you hear me. My English is not very good. I live in Italy 35 years and I am from Croatia. So it will be a mixed one. I'm not following the activity of museums, but I'm following recently restoration of film materials and cinema problems. And I found that exist some problems of conserving that data, because if you put some data on the hard disk, even on LTO, after some years, you must 5 years, you must transfer this data to another hard disk. And in this process, minimum of losing materials is 1%. So in 20 years, you will lose 5% of your data. What does it mean for one digital museum? Yeah, I'm asking this as a person that recently worked with one company that find a way how to save these materials for 1,000 years. And but I wanted to hear from you, what do you think about this problem? Because if some museum has a database, after 20 years, it will have 5% of this database. If you conserve and digitally restore one film of 10 minutes, in 20 years, you will have one masterpiece 5 minutes shorter. And this is the problem that one Norwegian company is solving. And I would like to see if it's some way to connect with the problems of the museums.
Yeah.
So I was waiting here to listen your explaining of digital museums, but I see the problem in basic, because some data will disappear.
Yeah. That's that's kind of been a real kind of issue within sort of museums and particularly their collecting and conservation of new media art. So again, sort of going through from sort of video art all the way sort of through to kind of digital art that's kind of got more interactive features and stuff. How do museums kind of collect those types of artworks that have, again, they might be on particular kind of sort of proprietary systems. They might be in certain types of digital file formats. There's all sorts of kind of things around how you kind of conserve that material or emulate, right? And so I'm sure all of us have been to museums where you might be seeing a kind of an artwork that would have been sort of on a piece of film, but it's being kind of projected on a data projector, and it's a digital file that's actually shown, not kind of an actual kind of celluloid film. Artworks by early sort of media artists like Nam June Paik, are kind of really interesting kind of cases, again, in terms of how do museums actually preserve the integrity of those works. And this problem has been sort of investigated by major museums like the Guggenheim in the US, SF MoMA, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. They've kind of done a number of projects, the Tate in London, all looking at kind of this idea of kind of time-based media and how museums need to kind of evolve their sort of conservation strategies specific to those art forms, because they raise particular kinds of problems. So it's a really interesting sort of, one, and that it has a dimension to it, which is around, the actual kind of digital content, but there's also the software aspects, there's also the hardware aspects, especially when we sort of think of kind of exaggerated cases like the work of Nam June Paik, who actually kind of explored, for instance, the television, right? And the technology of kind of, the actual kind of like cathode ray tube. How does that artwork survive when that actual technology, right, has become obsolete? And, one of the interesting things, and this is a little bit of an aside, but, the curator, or the lead conservator at the Smithsonian in Washington that had to be responsible for the preservation of those works, one of the things that they had to equally be concerned about, right, was not just like I said, the technology aspect. One of the things that Nam June Paik's work also did is it actually used the physical form of televisions as part of the artwork itself. And what he would do is he would actually drive around on the weekend looking for discarded television sets that people would be kind of throwing out. And he would actually kind of collect ones that were relevant because they might need a physical piece of, the hardware, a physical piece of the frame of the shape of the TV screen. And so the conservation effort there was as much a physical one in terms of that sort of archaeology as the media aspect of that as well. So yeah, I think that's kind of a really intriguing one. But a point I think that you were kind of raising is that kind of reminded me of something is when my colleague Aaron Rees presented on this idea of social data at our workshop in Vienna recently, he kind of brought out this concept of how we need to kind of, in terms of archiving, recognize that with digital objects, we have to think about what are referred to as significant properties of digital objects. So I draw your attention to a piece that was done by a guy named Andrew Wilson. This might be of interest to you specifically, who's from the National Archives in Australia. And he's kind of developed this kind of, I guess, approach to how recognizing significant properties is one way, okay, to actually kind of look at the problems that you're sort of raising there. And I guess asking, what is the significant thing that we're trying to retain around digital objects? And again, that kind of falls into some of that work that also has been done at Tate and places like that before around time-based media.
Yes. This is totally agree with you. It's a double the problem of, from one side, infrastructure, because of many countries lack of the proper infrastructure to restore and preserve and collect data, and also to maintain them, update them. And the other side is conceptual. So what of this program, of this data set is important to preserve? Also the mindset. How would you preserve the mindset of a project? So it's up to institution now, for my idea. In Italy, we have the Ministry of Culture with also the CNR, who is working with a huge infrastructure in order to create a task force to collect all the digital data. But I guess that proper specific action dedicated to each singular project has to be taken by each singular institution. You mentioned the case of the Tate Gallery and the Getty Research Institute. That's also working in the same way with these platforms such as Conifer, for instance. But we can also mention a similar model with the with that machine, the archive.org. It's really similar. So creating maybe a mutual task force or a project that would support the now existing data.
And that's where, like, again, sort of going back about sort of 20 years, the Guggenheim sort of did a project that kind of proposed what was referred to as the variable media approach. And again, that was a proposal to museums to kind of understand that, you know, what again is it that is being collected so that works can kind of be reactivated and performed in the future. And one aspect of that is the intentionality of the artist, right? So are you preserving something that's physical and material and concentrating purely on that, which I guess traditionally is what conservation in museums has been about. It's been about the integrity of the physical artifact being maintained, restored, whatever, to recognize that in terms of sort of contemporary forms of artwork, it's actually more about what was the artist intending this work to do? How can we capture that intention so that if decisions have to be made around how a work needs to be presented because the technology is no longer available or whatever, it's like, no, that's okay, because the intention of the artist has still been maintained, even if the delivery method, let's say, has actually kind of changed. There's also, of course, the idea of interaction. Like, what is an audience supposed to do with this work, right? How does that get kind of, I guess, kind of, you know, documented? How does that get kind of, you know, again, kind of included with, let's say, a collection record? How does that then give a guidance to curators or to, you know, institutions in the future to say, it's okay to show the work in this way, or this is what you're trying to achieve in terms of interaction with an audience? That's something that has to also be kind of now collected.
Sure. Other question?
Can I only add something?
Something more? Oh, Ulrike, another question. But if you don't mind, we now we can give the word to Ulrike, and then Pedra, maybe you can conclude with your further thoughts. Please, Ulrike, if you want also to turn on your microphone.
Okay. Hello. Thank you also so much for your insights. It's probably even a follow-on on what you explained already. You mentioned data literacy, that you wanted to discuss this as well. Now I have to raise my hand and say I have completely no clue about the museum sector as well. That's why it is also especially interesting to listen to it. I was wondering, because I come from a background also from data management, and we talk about data curation, but you also mentioned the curators being, in parentheses, being thrown out and being replaced by designers. Now, you probably didn't mean it as harsh as I'm putting it, but it's still leaving question marks. Which kind of competencies you actually refer to when you talked about data literacy in the museum context?
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, you probably took it a little bit, or you just expressed it in perhaps a little bit too black and white a term. But no, I think kind of again the thing around kind of the skills aspect. One of the things that I've been fortunate through my collaborations with the University of Leicester to have been involved in a related program that was actually looking at the data, the digital skills and the digital skills development of museum workers. This was a project that was run, I think, until about 2019, 2020, that was called One by One. It was a project that was led by my colleague, Ross Parry. And it was, again, an effort to kind of recognize that in terms of the digital skills inside museums, we have to recognize that there are many different dimensions to that skill in terms of, a technical ability to kind of do something with, a particular piece of software, or to do something for a particular purpose. But equally, there's a literacy that's kind of involved in that as well. An ability to kind of discriminate and make decisions around, why would I use a particular, even if I have that skill to do something digitally, why would I apply it in a particular context to sort of solve a particular issue? So it kind of was basically became a digital literacy framework, right? That was developed by the One by One project. And that's going to be a cornerstone of the book that's coming out next year on museums and digital confidence. And basically what we've kind of done, this recent sort of workshop with the Belvedere was kind of a response to an observatory meeting that we had with Austrian partners that basically said we need a kind of, or there's a recognition that the understanding of data and the need, therefore, for a data literacy to kind of be put on the agenda, kind of, that takes some ideas from that sort of digital literacy framework. That was kind of what we were testing out with that first workshop. So we're looking to continue to kind of evolve and develop things in those directions. And again, maybe it'd be interesting for you to maybe sort of have a look at the One by One sort of project, because there are sort of publications online available for that kind of outline what that sort of digital skills and digital literacy framework involves. And it might be of interest and of relevance to what you were just asking.
Thank you. So, other question? I see a comment from Franz Fischer, our director. A note. Okay, he is suggesting this article, this paper with our journal magazine related to this data collected, data preservation. So,
that was just to our beautiful John and to say something. No, if I may, so once I unmuted myself, so things become even more complicated as far as I see. If we look at generative AI art, of course, so where we even have a problem so even more, so the problem is bigger to describe what is actually the artwork and the performative character, the ever-changing form of the thing is changing, and so how to preserve then an algorithm or the output of the algorithm, or what's the concept if the artist even let it just go and develop it for themselves. So we come into beautiful trouble. So I mean that's part of the art to challenge, I think, our concepts, and museums and curators are then asked to do something about it. So that's just another aspect, another layer of complexity that I wanted to mention. And the other question, the task of the curator or the collector or the museum of choice. So what we actually choose. So there's so much going on in the digital, so born digital art, and the question of canon. And so I see it all ends, things are getting loose and challenging, and whatever choice we make becomes more and more arbitrary and questionable. I mean, that's also the fun of the things, and that has maybe been always like this, but it's the sheer amount of artworks and digital twins of artworks, and then purification, mashups, and collage. So it's fascinating, but so I don't want to be in the role of someone who takes responsibility for this. So we can reflect on this. So that's the digital critical aspect that we humanists. So that's a role that we can take, but taking responsibility and to maintain and sustain these things is really a mission impossible, it seems.
It seems that it looks like this performative power of data you were almost mentioning, because it's a challenge and also as a risk. So we have to take care about the quality of the data we are mining and collecting and also delivering, and for what purposes? Because artists use data in the museum in order to create interaction between data and engage in new kind of interaction and performance. And in the same way, curators are the performance of these data in the museum collection. So I'm starting to see a kind of avant-garde, because we are in the same level of the 20s of the 20th century, when the power of display and the power of a collection started to coexist, and the role of the audience as a visitors and from our side as a user plays a crucial role in manipulating, interacting, and performing the collection itself with the mediation, in this case, of the curator. So our new challenge within the museum nowadays, a laboratory, not just a closed space preservation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No answers. We're not giving you answers.
No.
We're recognizing kind of the challenges, and in some ways I guess is it about solving those challenges, or is it about kind of working with them and raising, that's always been the course of art in some ways, is to kind of take things beyond what the solution, and kind of sort of problematizing that, and sort of again pushing forward in that way. So
in dynamic way. So any other question from here and from home? Any other comments, conclusions? If someone of you want to add something more, I'm sorry, Predrag, I interrupted you, but everyone who wants to say something else. If not, I would thank again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invitation.
We are really honored and delighted to have you here. So before leaving, it's my turn to give you some information, because I'm talking on behalf of our director, otherwise he got angry. on me, and I don't want. So next appointment, next 13 of November with Amanda Maiden for our seminar series. We have mapping urban violence in Venice and the terra firma between 14 and 15th century, 17th century, using GIS. Okay, so don't miss our next seminar, and thank you for joining us both virtually and in present here. Thank you, guys, again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.